to myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not.
Hi, welcome along to Steve Wraith's True Crime Podcast. Delighted to see I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Robin Perrie. How are you, Robin?
I'm good, thanks. Good, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, great to have you on, mate. And some of the regular viewers who watch everything on our channel will remember Robin was giving us his online reports from Ukraine, and we'll thank him for that. And he's now, as well as his daytime job as a journalist, put pen to paper with the new book, and it is called I'm the Yorkshire Ripper, Conversations with a Killer. And this is co-written with Alfie James. So we're going to talk about Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, and it's a case which fascinates many people, and obviously something that as a 50-year-old I actually lived through as well. And just first of all, why did you decide to do this book, Robin?
Well, it's you've sort of hit the nail on the head with your own experience, really. I'm the same. It's a story which I've always been fascinated with. I'm 1 or 2 years older than you. I grew up on Teesside, just north of Yorkshire, but close enough for the story to be ever present, really. So I've grown up through the late 1970s. It was something you were always aware of. Every few months, it seemed that on the breakfast news, before you listen to the radio, before you went to school, there was a report of, sadly, yet another attack, and then the police would confirm it was the work of the Yorkshire Ripper, and became kind of like a bogeyman of our sort of childhood, really. It was something everyone feared that the next time he would attack might be in our region, and that sort of stayed with me. After school, I went to Leeds to study at the university there, and then got a job as a journalist on a couple of local papers in Leeds and near Leeds, working with reporters who were a good few years older and had actually reported on the case right from day one. So that obviously fascinated me as well. And so, as I say, it's something that's always been there. One of the cases I've been most interested in. And then a few years ago, about 10 years ago now, I met Alfie through doing other stories on the Yorkshire Ripper, and it became apparent that he had this huge library of raw material, really, thanks to the relationship he developed with Peter Sutcliffe, which I think we'll probably go into a bit more in depth later on the chat. But he developed this relationship and acquired this huge amount of material from him, and wasn't really sure about what he was going to do with it. And through discussions with Alfie, it became apparent, it was kind of obvious that formed the foundation of this biography of Peter Sutcliffe.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the man himself, and let's go back to his childhood first and foremost. And he was raised by a loving mum, but an abusive dad, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. It was a real stark contrast, really, between his two parents. So he was born in June 1946 in a maternity hospital in Bingley and Shipley, and he spent the vast majority of his childhood growing up in Bingley. It's a market town close to Bradford. And he's brought up by Dad John and Mum Kathleen. And as I say, there was a real marked difference in the way they parented, basically. Dad John was an abusive, absent parent, really, neglectful. He didn't pay much attention to his wife or his children. He could be violent. He was a drinker, a womanizer, and basically spent all his money in the pub and on himself, really, giving very little or only just enough to his wife to care for their increasing family. Peter was one of 6, or one of 7 rather, but his one brother died within a few days of being born. So there were 6 kids, 3 boys, 3 girls, growing up in a very loud, raucous household.
The abuse that he suffered, I mean, I've done a lot of true crime podcasts, and I often find that what lies at the heart of a criminal is trauma. Do you think that had anything to do with the offending that he went on to commit?
Yeah, possibly. Again, I think we'll probably just chat more in depth about the motivations in a short time. But very possibly. I mean, Sutcliffe himself denied that. He sort of said that despite all the difficulties growing up and the abuse his father meted out to the children, he says he actually had an enjoyable childhood, and certainly with his mother, he was incredibly close to his mother, and that was something his father resented as well. Actually, his father kind of resented Peter, partly because of how close he was to his mother. His dad just felt he just wasn't a manly enough child, which is a crazy thing to say given how young he was, but so there was trauma there in relation to his father. Did it have anything to do with his future offending? Sutcliffe himself said not, and he made the point that for all there was abuse there, his brothers Mick and Carl suffered worse abuse. His father would beat them with his hands and his belt, and he was physical sometimes with Peter, but not quite as bad as with the other two.
How did he perform at school? I mean, was he a good scholar?
Not particularly. He had a talent for art, and he wasn't lacking in some degree of intelligence, but school just wasn't for him really. He left at 15 with no qualifications whatsoever. But of course, that was in the early 60s, at a time when there was a huge number of engineering firms and mills and that kind of thing along the valley where he grew up. So he didn't want for work. He got a variety of jobs, despite his lack of qualifications. But going back to school, another marked aspect was his lack of ability really to click with any particular friendship group. He was a bit of a loner. There's another aspect. His father sort of seemed to annoy his father, his inability to make any particular strong friendship groups. And it would be quite a long time before he sort of really seemed to develop that ability to sort of be part of a wider group.
One constant in his life, because he met her quite young as well, of course, was Sonia Sutcliffe. Tell us a little bit about how they met.
Yeah, it is a fascinating aspect of the whole story. So they met in a pub called the Fisherman's Cove. It was a little discotheque that had been kind of a pub that had been turned into a discotheque. And by that time, Peter was working as a gravedigger at Bingley Cemetery, and he'd finally sort of got in with a group of colleagues who thought he was okay, who didn't think he was a weird loner. So he sort of like developed this friendship group with them, and they would have regular nights out to this pub, and they developed one little corner into their own little area that they call Gravedigger's Corner in this pub. He was 20 at the time. 1920, Sonia was 15, 16. There was 4 years difference, and she came in with her elder sister one night. They told their father, who was very strict, that they were going to a classical musical or an opera, I think, but that actually were sort of heading out to do what a lot of teenagers want to do at that age, is to go to the disco. And Peter and Sonia got chatting, and they clicked, and it was the start of an incredible relationship, really, which despite everything that happened in the future, and despite them getting divorced, that relationship continued until the day he died.
Yeah, quite an amazing relationship, and one, as you say, which went on so long. I notice in the notes that you sent us about the book, you mentioned a row that took place between them that led to his first attack. What was that? Yeah,
that's a really significant event, and it's sort of kicks the book off, really. Chapter 1 is all about Peter was head over heels. He was really in love. They were engaged, and he was convinced that Sonia felt the same way about him. But he then discovered, thanks to his brother Mick, who had seen her driving through Bingley in a white top sports car with an Italian businessman who ran an ice cream firm. Peter refused to believe that anything might be going on, or she might be growing close or becoming friendly with another man. He asked around. He discovered the truth that that Sonia had become friendly with this guy. So he confronted her. He sort of wanted to know what was going on and why she had become friendly with another guy. This confrontation just went from bad to worse. He ended up having a furious row in the street, and she stormed off, he stormed off. And then he developed this idea in his mind, that in this sort of increasingly twisted mind, he'd been hearing the voices for a few years by now, and his increasingly twisted mind, he came up with this idea that to get his revenge on what he, in his mind, thought Sonia was doing to him, he would do the same back to her. And that's when he first went to pick up a street sex worker in the red light area in Bradford. This woman took him back to a room she used to take clients back to. He quickly had second thoughts. They had a row over the money, and when he'd given her a tenner, she was charging a fiver, so he needed a fiver change. And to get that fiver, she took him back to a garage on Manningham Lane or Lum Lane in the red light district. And two guys came out from the garage armed with spanners and tried to attack him. He drove his car at them. It was just a sort of nightmare scenario. And in his mind, this disturbed mind was sort of building, and this helped develop the idea that sex workers were his target. He had to sort of take action against sex workers because we were all tied up with this crumbling nature of his relationship with Sonia, which was resurrected. They got back together. She stopped sort of seeing this Italian guy, and her and Peter went on to get married. But by now it was set in his mind, this idea that to him, action had to be taken against this group of women in society that he saw were a problem.
Yeah, fascinating. Never heard that particular story before. You mentioned hearing voices. When did he first started hearing voices?
Yeah, so that was in the mid-60s when he'd been working at the cemetery for a while, and it was one particular day. It was cloudy. It was starting to rain, and he's in this grave in the Catholic section of Bingley Cemetery, digging a grave on his own, and he hears what sounds to him like a strange noise, kind of not really sort of formulated as an actual voice at that stage. It seems so weird, like echoey kind of sound, and him and a few of his colleagues were very, very clear practical jokers. They were constantly playing practical jokes against each other. And of course, the cemetery is ripe for that kind of thing, to try and scare each other. He was convinced that this sound was one of his work colleagues playing a practical joke on him. So he climbs out the grave and looks around. He can't see anyone. It's starting to rain a bit heavier now. He looks around, walks around some graves, and he realizes this sound seems to be coming from a particular grave of a Polish man called Bronislaw Sapolsky. He walks over, and it's quite a grand looking headstone, white cross on a plinth, and these voices seem to be coming out of it. He described them as an echo, and they were coming out of them. And this happened again and again. He didn't tell anybody. He didn't tell Sonia. He didn't tell his mother. And they were the two people he was closest to in the world. It was his secret. And over the coming weeks and months, these kind of formed into a more specific kind of voice that he kind of could understand. It was kind of like a radio which is out of tune, starting to come into tune. And all of a sudden, he started to hear this voice. And as he would say it, this voice, he kind of started to realize in his mind that he thought it was a voice from God, and this voice from God started telling him that he had to kill prostitutes.
Wow, unbelievable, isn't it? To think that was, in his own mind, how it started. You talk about two incidents which you say raised the serious questions over his claimed voices that drove him to kill. Tell us about that. Victim number 7, I think, Yvonne Pearson.
Yeah. So there's two aspects which are sort of fascinating, really, in the whole case. So there's very much when it got to his trial, there was very much a split between the medical experts and the police and the prosecution as to whether he was the motivation for the attacks were mental illness, paranoid schizophrenia, or whether he was just putting it on, whether he sort of lied to the doctors to kid them that he was suffering from some mental illness, and the voices were an entire fiction. Over the long term, ultimately, the medical world won, obviously, because he got transferred to Broadmoor and spent his entire life there. And the medical world throughout his life were at one that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Now, I'm not a medical professional, and I've got a few different thoughts and opinions about that, but I wouldn't necessarily disregard their opinions completely. However, there are two incidents which raise huge question marks over whether that mental illness was the main driver. So with his attacks, there was always a period, like a build-up, if you like, where he was hearing the voices for a period of probably days, maybe weeks, and he was kind of becoming primed to act, to kill. Now, with Yvonne Pearson in January of 1978, who, as you say, his 7th victim, he was driving along Lum Lane on the way home from work, and she stepped out in front of his car. He hadn't been having the voices, he wasn't being primed, she just stepped out, he wound the window down, And she said, "Are you looking for business?" He suddenly thought, "Wow, this is fate," and he decided to kill her there and then. He just decided to kill her. So she gets in his car. They drove off to some nearby wasteland, and he attacked her and killed her. So this wasn't as unlike all of the others. He wasn't being primed, in his words, by his mental illness, which built. It was a case of it's almost like he had self-will. He was exhibiting self-will to make that decision himself, which undermines the idea that the only motivating factor was his mental illness. The other factor is the previous victim, number 6, Jean Jordan, who he murdered in Manchester in October of the previous year, 1977. Now, he killed her at some allotments next to a cemetery to the south of the city. And as he drove away, he realised that he'd left a potentially vital clue, which was a brand new £5 note, which he'd been given his wages just a few days before the previous Thursday. And he was wise enough to know that if it's brand new £5 note, hadn't gone through the system, it could potentially be traced through his employer to him, and he was absolutely right. That would become one of the most crucial lines of inquiry the police would embark on. So 9 days later, he realised he had to do something about this. So he basically drove back across to Manchester in a forensically aware frame of mind to try and recover this £5 note, and make sure the police didn't uncover a vital clue. He was unable to find the fiver. It was actually in a secret pocket within a handbag, which he'd thrown away from the scene. And he could never find it, couldn't recover it. And he ended up in a frenzy that night. He was so angry that he attacked the body again. It'd been lying there for 9 days, but he attacked it again. So she was left in a terrible, terrible condition. Short time later, somebody working at the allotment found the handbag, handed it to the police. The police found the fiver. And it was, as I say, a critical investigation. They came very close to tracking him down over that. And he actually was interviewed, one of the number of times that he was interviewed by police when they failed to arrest him. And it was a huge inquiry, and it did get close to pinpointing who the killer was, but it didn't. It failed. But again, that was an example of where it certainly seemed clear seems clear to me that he'd spent the entire intervening period between killing her and return to the scene 9 days, and he clearly wasn't in a psychotic state through that 9 days. He was acting, as the prosecution said at the trial, just like any criminal acts, to try and avoid capture, which clearly doesn't seem to be the product of a mental illness. It's a product of a criminal mind trying to evade arrest.
Why do you think he killed Robin?
It is a hugely complicated area, and it's the longest chapter in the book, and in many ways it's my favorite chapter of the book, and it's one of the reasons that it sort of drives my interest really in working out why he killed her. So there's a variety of competing theories. Many theories over the years have been posted. The ones that were aired at his trial was that he was a sexually motivated killer, that he got some sort of thrill from it, that the prosecution claimed was the case. The opposing view from the defence was that it was purely the case. It was it was a product of his mental illness. Personally, I think there probably was some kind of mental illness there. However, I can't accept that it was the only motivating factor. If that was the case, then after many years' treatment at Broadmoor, the medical experts considered that they brought it under control to the extent that he was able to be transferred back to Franklin in 2016. However, he continued to have, he was always desperate to be seen as a good person, despite what he'd done. He considered the attacks were the product of a mental illness in a short period of his life, and he could kind of pack them away in a little box that he didn't have to take responsibility for. He didn't own his crimes. They were the cause of his mental illness through those 5 years. He, as a person, Peter Sutcliffe, throughout his life, was a good person. But some of the stuff he said to Alfie over the years clearly suggested there was some badness there, if you like. He would make fun of his victims. He would accuse the survivors or relatives of the women who didn't survive as being publicity seekers. He would say some awful things. And if he was a man who would just done terrible acts through 5 years because of a mental illness. Many years later, when it was under control, he wouldn't say horrible things about his victims. He would be appalled at what he'd done and spend every day regretting it. And that just wasn't how he came across at all. So I think there's got to be, as well as potentially some mental illness there was something in him. If we want to call it evil, we'll call it evil, whatever. But there's some innate badness in him that there's a prime motivation as well, I feel.
Obviously, he did go to prison, but then, you know, ended up in Broadmoor Hospital, somewhere where I visited, of course, when I visited the infamous Ronnie Cray for a 5-year period between 1990 and 1995. So you obviously spent time not only in Broadmoor with Ronnie Cray, but some other famous or infamous names.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, over the years, I mean, he came across, I guess, you know, some of all the ones we would know for the headlines. In Parkhurst, in the first prison he was at after his conviction, he spent some time with Ian Brady, and they had a particular strange relationship. They didn't know each other that well or spend a lot of time together, but they spent some time together in Parkhurst. They played chess together, and Sutcliffe claimed he won. And then in many years later, they had this strange battle as to who was the most high profile. And Brady did some interviews where he claimed he was the most high profile killer in the country and seemed to take some kind of plus from that. Sutcliffe thought this was a ridiculous thing to say, and why would anyone claim to be the highest profile? But he then couldn't help himself, and he would go on to sort of to claim that he was more high profile than Brady. So that was sort of some strange, weird relationship. He met both of the Cray twins, Reggie in Parkhurst, and then, as you say, Ronnie in Broadmoor. And it's an interesting, as a bit of an aside, an interesting controversial aspect of our book is that Sutcliffe claims that him and Ronnie actually got on okay together. And when the book came out, I know some people who've read into the Cray story a lot weren't very happy at that idea because you know, Ronnie and Reggie were sort of said to have put a contract out on him. And he was, as you can see some pictures there, he was attacked a couple of times in Broadmoor. Clearly some people didn't like the idea of sharing the hospital with Sutcliffe, and they took the matter into his own hands. In later years, when he was transferred to Frankland, he was on the same wing as Ian Huntley, who was who murdered the 2 schoolgirls in Soham, and also Levi Belfield, who the Millie Dowler killer. And Sutcliffe particularly didn't like Levi Belfield. He didn't trust him at all. But Belfield claims that they were friends. So there's another sort of strange interaction between different high-profile killers. And perhaps one of the strangest friends that he made was Charles Taylor, the African dictator who was done at the International Court in The Hague a few years ago. And as part of the international agreement to bring him to justice for genocide and war crimes, was that the UK would take Taylor and he would serve his time here in this country. And he was ended up in Frankland in Durham, slightly weirdly. And probably because of their similar age, Peter Sutcliffe and Charles Taylor became best of mates. And Sutcliffe would sort of make comments about, how despite the fact he's in for genocide, he seems like a good bloke and lends me his TV listings magazine. So a bit of an insight into how the horrific big picture stuff that they get convicted for interacts with the mundane day-to-day.
One man who, of course, evaded conviction, but is nonetheless infamous for heinous crimes is this man. And he spent a little bit of time with Jimmy Savile in Broadmoor.
He did indeed, yeah. They became particularly close, probably because of the Yorkshire connection. Of course, Jimmy Savile lived in Leeds, and he lived in quite a well-to-do, exclusive apartment block in Roundhay Park. He had the penthouse suite there, right where, just yards away from where Sutcliffe killed Irene Richardson, his third victim. And Savile was actually interviewed by the police about that case as a potential witness. So that's one sort of strange coincidence. But yes, Savile, as is commonly known these days now, he had a very high profile and a kind of self-appointed role as the unofficial entertainments manager at Broadmoor. He had access to all the wards. He had his own apartment there, and the bosses at the time, they liked the cachet of having someone, a celebrity like Savile, associated with them. And sadly, he abused that freedom to abuse some patients in Broadmoor. But when it all came out after his death, as to what actually he had been up to all these years, Sutcliffe just refused to believe it. He couldn't accept that his old mate Jimmy Savile would be was guilty of such heinous crimes, and even when the evidence was so overwhelming that even he had to admit he might have done one or two of these things in his mind, he could never accept that he was guilty of such a horrific litany of abuse that we all now know that Savile was.
Obviously, you've worked the beat in the Northeast for many years now for the Sun newspaper, and I think one of the most intriguing things about this whole case was, of course, the tapes that were sent to the police officers at the time, and poor old George. I mean, he looks sick as a chip here, and things just went from bad to worse for George when those tapes landed on his desk, and he moved the entire investigation from where it should have been focused up to the Northeast, and in particular Wearside. And it wasn't until years later we found out that it was this man, Mr. Humble, who had sent in these hoax tapes and duly served a little bit of bird for it. But what did Sutcliffe, if anything, make of that whole scenario? I presume he must have been delighted.
Yeah, absolutely. And he viewed it was a gift from God. Literally, he sort of thought God was directing somebody else to send in these letters and to misdirect the police investigation, which of course arguably potentially cost a few women their lives. There was a few murders in the time that the police case was directed up towards Wearside, but it was a fascinating aspect of the case, and I guess any case as large as this is going to have different strands to it, which increase its fascination for true crime, people interested in true crime. And so there was 3 letters were sent, one to the Daily Mirror in Manchester, and one to the police, and then a third letter was also sent. And then a tape, and it was as the letters were coming in, and they came in over a period of months. The first one was kind of just dismissed. I mean, there's lots of cranks were writing in, and lots of hoaxes were getting sent. So it was kind of dismissed initially, and then the second one came in, and then the third, and then the tape. And bit by bit, George and other senior detectives decided that actually there was just too much detail in these letters to have been written by somebody who didn't have first-hand knowledge of the attacks, i.e. the killer. But it's a fascinating aspect, and it's hard for us in 2022 to appreciate this. Because we're so used to the internet now, so we can find out anything in an instant, but the internet didn't exist then, of course. And George was convinced that that these were genuine because it contained details of an attack, a murder of a woman called Joan Harrison in Preston in 1975. And the writer of the letters was claiming them as his work, as the work of the Ripper. It ultimately proved to be that the Sutcliffe hadn't killed that woman. It was an unconnected murder. But there was some details about that case in the letters that George was convinced that it had never been reported, never been published in the papers. And also some details about one or two of the early murders that Sutcliffe did do, that he was convinced hadn't been reported. Now, of course, now you could find that out in an instant. Within seconds, you could check, has this been in the press or not? Then it was such a hard effort. I mean, it was still possible to check by going across to Lancashire, checking hard copies of old newspapers. But the police just didn't go through all that to that extent. So George became convinced this can only have been written by the killer, but he was obviously wrong. But what that resulted was that all of the resources were sent north to Wearside, and the order went out to all of the detectives working on the case that if they interviewed any potential suspect, they had to get an example of his handwriting and also check his accent. Did he have any connection with Sunderland? And if somebody gave their handwriting and it didn't match the letter, or if they didn't have a Wearside accent, then they were discounted. And this applied to Sutcliffe. Sutcliffe was interviewed 9 times by the police before his arrest. And in the later stage of the investigation, a couple of them within a couple of them interviews, he was asked for examples of his handwriting, and it was obviously noted he had a Bradford Bingley accent, and he was discarded because of it. And it's just incredible that they put so many eggs in one basket. And they even brought on board a couple of linguistic experts from Yorkshire, I think it was from Leeds University, to analyse the whole tapes and the letters, and they became convinced that there was a very strong possibility that that it might be in the work of a super hoaxer, so called because there were many hoaxes that afflicted the inquiry, but none of them resulted in the inquiry being the direction of the inquiry being diverted. This one did. So it was termed a super hoaxer, and these guys, the linguistic experts, were convinced that that it was the work of a hoaxer, not the killer. But the police were deaf to that. They wouldn't take on board even the work of the experts, and to the day of the arrest, they were convinced that the killer was from Wearside. But one other interesting aspect is that Northumbria police, who obviously were running the Wearside end of the investigation, they were more sceptical. The publicity posters that were put out by West Yorkshire Police basically said to the public, listen to this tape. We think it's the voice of the killer, and the handwriting is the handwriting of the killer. Northumbria worded their appeal posters differently. They would sort of put out, do you recognise this handwriting? It couldn't be linked to the case. Please contact us. They were far more sceptical, and right to the end, they didn't want to put everything in. And the senior officers in Northumbria advised their detectives just, we have to follow this line inquiry, but be wary, remain cautious. But George Oldfield was all in that the killer was from Wearside.
Amazing, and of course more victims passed away because of that. I always find this case particularly fascinating. You've already mentioned that he was questioned on numerous occasions. We know about the red herring with the tapes and the letters coming from Wearside. We had many cases where people managed to survive attacks and gave pretty good descriptions. When you look at the various artists' impressions that were given about this guy, it's it beggars belief that he wasn't caught earlier. And of course, when he was caught by a fluke, really.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it's those photo pictures. It's a great picture you put up there, and it shows that some of them are pretty good likenesses. But the police didn't. They were reluctant to take on board some of the eyewitness accounts. For a couple of reasons, some good, some awful. They were sceptical at taking the testimony of anyone who'd suffered a severe head injury, and some women who did survive did have long-term consequences. So that's perhaps understandable. Less acceptable is that Marcella Claxton, who was a black woman who lived in Chapeltown, was attacked and survived. And the police didn't believe her purely on the basis of racism. They were trying to convince her again and again and again that her attacker was black and she'd been attacked by a local man from Chapeltown. She kept insisting, no, he was white. This is his description. And they would never ever took Marcella's cases to be involved in a series of attacks, and her case was only included once Sutcliffe was arrested and admitted it himself. So that was appalling, the way the police refused to accept her testimony. But yeah, as you say, winding on to January of 1981, January the 2nd, 1981, two beat bobbies in Sheffield were on a routine patrol. One of them was a sergeant, much more experienced. The other one was a PC who was just starting out. And as part of his mentoring role, the sergeant sort of said, let's have a troll of the tour of the red light district tonight. And the police at that time were very much in the way of arresting street sex workers. And he said, let's go and see if anyone's working tonight so we can arrest them. And this will help teach you how to prepare a file for a soliciting charge at court. They had a drive around the regular red light district in Sheffield. There was no one working that night, so they went to a private secluded street behind Sheffield Girls High School, and there was one particular. It was a large detached house which had been converted into offices, and they found a car parked in the drive. And what was immediately obvious that there was something suspicious was the way it was parked. Sutcliffe had driven in, turned around and reversed up the drive, so his car was pointing out, so he clearly could make a quick escape. But of course, punters taking a woman, a sex worker up there, wouldn't park that way. They would park the other way around, pointing in for privacy. So the police immediately thought there was something up. with this. They also very quickly noticed that the tax date and the registration number didn't match. He'd stolen some number plates and was driving on false plates. And so they interviewed him. He gave a false name that didn't match with the details of the car. So very quickly he had to sort of confess his real name. So him and the woman were taken that he was with at the time, that he picked up that night. They were taken to a police station in Sheffield. And he was interviewed, denied it all for many hours, but then ultimately realised the game was up and finally confessed. And so after all these years and all these different inquiries, all these attacks, the police finally had the Yorkshire Ripper, and those are the two guys that arrested him. And after all them different inquiries, all them different detectives and experts and different avenues, it was just purely old-fashioned beat bobbies on a routine patrol.
Unbelievable, really, that that was how he was arrested. And the public feeling was high. And I think we all remember, the day that the Ripper was caught. Anyone of a certain age or vintage will remember it, because as you quite aptly described him at the start of the interview, it was like the bogeyman of our times. And I think it made it all the more sinister when he was first led into the police station from the back of the van under a blanket.
Yeah, absolutely. And the police were so desperate to get him into court for that first appearance that it was actually very late in the day. Obviously, most people, when they appear in magistrates' court, they've got to report to the court at 10 a.m. and appear through the morning. But this case was unique, and so it was obviously January. It was dark. It was about 4:30, 5 o'clock. And you can see there's some video footage on YouTube. It's of that moving video footage of that scene. You can quite easily find it on YouTube if you just search for it. And there's a huge crowd there, and they're throwing insults, they're shouting at him, and he's brought in. And as you say, the fact that we still haven't seen him sort of in the flesh, so to speak. His head was covered, so it kind of increases the sort of like the sinister nature of it. And it was a huge event globally, really. The police press office. That's the picture that was taken at a later court hearing, I think, or when he was brought out. And the police press office was receiving calls from America, Australia. This was a world event, because it's actually. Obviously, there's a fair number of serial killers exist in America, but it's a very rare event for somebody with that number of victims to their name to be at large for that length of time. I mean, he's not the most prolific serial killer the country's ever known. Harold Shipman and potentially Dennis Nielsen have all had more victims, but of course and Fred West, but the people like all those three. The victims were only known after their arrest. They were killing people, and it wasn't known at the time that they were actually killing people, that they were at large. Sutcliffe is unique in that sense, that his tally of victims was sadly, totting up as he was still in large, which increased the threat that communities across the north felt. And as you say, that's where that image of him being a modern day, that day's bogeyman did reside in people's minds.
Now, obviously, you've linked up on this book, I'm the Yorkshire Ripper, Conversations with a Killer, with a lad called Alfie James. Now, Alfie went down a similar route to me. He wrote to somebody behind bars. The difference between Alfie and I is I wrote to a gangster. He wrote to a serial killer. What was his motivation?
I think it's Alfie's role in this is fascinating, really, and I guess his motivation very, very similar, I'm sure, to yours when you started this similar thing, is just trying to get under the skin of what makes these people tick. So Alfie basically he's a very ordinary guy, really. He works at a factory. He's married. He's got a couple of young kids, but he's a huge fan of true crime, and like a lot of people who are interested in that genre, that one of the main motivating factors for their interest is understanding why do people commit the most heinous crimes against each other, and why do they do it again and again, against someone else rather, and why do they do it again and again. And he'd read a number of books on this issue, but he just kind of felt there was something a bit missing. Books by ex-police officers, lawyers, medical professionals, they're okay so far as they go, but he felt they didn't go that last step in really explaining why these people do what they did. So he just thought, well, actually, I'll just write to them and ask them. And he wrote to a few. He wrote to Ian Brady. He wrote to a serial killer in America. He wrote to Sutcliffe, and Sutcliffe simply was the one who replied the most readily. He got a few replies off Brady, but that relationship didn't really develop. But the relationship with Sutcliffe did. Sutcliffe replied quite cautiously at first, but then Alfie wrote back, and that developed. And then Sutcliffe eventually trusted him enough to place him on the list of people who he was able to phone, and it got to the stage where there was a weekly phone call from Sutcliffe to Alfie at home from Broadmoor, and then ultimately he trusted him enough to add him to his list of visitors. So Alfie would go and visit him in Broadmoor, and he, very in a very sort of efficient, professional kind of manner. Alfie kept all this material, and over many years he collated hundreds of letters, notes from all these phone calls, hundreds of phone calls, and dozens of face-to-face meetings. And I basically got as close to Sutcliffe as anyone ever has done outside of the inner circle of his closest family.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story and a fascinating book as well. I guess I've got to ask you the question you would ask me, I guess, with the Craze story. And is it right to give somebody like Peter Sutcliffe a platform and do a book using his words? I mean, the one thing I think we always have to remember, and it's a respectable thing. I do it all the time when I'm covering true crime on this channel, is to pay tribute to the victims. And I'd like to dedicate this podcast to the victims and to the families who've had to suffer. But getting back to the question, is it right, do you think?
Yeah, it's an absolute valid question, and it's one that has to be asked. And it was very much in the forefront of my mind, researching the book and then writing it. And I thought long and hard before we started on this project as whether it was the right thing to do. And I was conscious that some people would perhaps object to it, and I'm completely accepting of that opinion. The reason I thought that it was something that I wanted to press on with was it was a factor of the Ripper story which had never been told. The book, that extent of extensive input from him about all aspects of his life, it had never been written, and so I thought that was a valid addition, valuable addition to the sort of the body of work that had been written about him. But I think that had to be done with making sure that we had to make sure that his wasn't the only voice within that story. The victim's voice had to be there as well, and I hopefully I've achieved that. I've made a big effort to tell all of their stories in a three-dimensional fashion, to give their background, to explain how some of them who ended up in awful situations in their lives, how they ended up through no fault of their own in that situation, which sadly forced their paths to cross with Sutcliffe's path, and meant they ended up as his victims. And I think as long as anyone who sort of writes a true crime book or embarks on this kind of project in relation to the Ripper, as long as you don't forget the victims and make sure their voices are heard as well, then I felt that was an okay path to take. Yeah.
I've seen it said on many a platform, the best thing to come out of COVID was the death of Peter Sutcliffe. Of course, he passed away 13th of November 2020 in Durham in the University Hospital. And, I don't think there was many tears shed, Robin.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm pretty close to the Neil Jackson, the son of his second victim, Emily Jackson, and I remember speaking to Neil quite soon after that event, and he for one was, I don't know if celebrating is the right word or not, but you're right. Not many people would have mourned the passing of Peter Sutcliffe. As I say, you're right. He died of he'd had serious health problems over many years. He had diabetes, had a heart condition, he had eye issues, he was almost blind. And he had angina, and when the pandemic hit, visiting at Franklin stopped. People could no longer go in to see him. Lockdown came, and when lockdown was eased, visiting started up again. But he refused to have anyone in visiting him. He was obsessed with the idea that COVID was a killer disease, and he thought he would get it, and proved to be his prediction came true, and he developed a heart condition which needed him to go into the University Hospital of Durham in early November 2020, and he was in and out of hospital over a couple of days, and then as a result of that, he tested positive for COVID and died shortly afterwards. Yeah.
Is it true that some of his ashes were sent to two superfans?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there was a couple. Alfie isn't one of them. He never received any of the ashes, but a couple of people who had also written to him received some ashes. I think the ashes were sent to his brother Mick, and then he sent them on to some of these people, which which is a strange aspect. I kind of feel, but that's and I suppose that leads into sort of the question some people have asked of Alfie, really. There's the idea of why would anyone write to a serial killer? Alfie's motivation was purely honourable in my view, in that he simply wanted to understand what made Sutcliffe tick. And just because Alfie isn't a trained criminologist or a psychiatrist doesn't mean to say he doesn't have the same sort of right, I suppose, to try and discover these things. But somebody who then sort of collects artifacts in that way is whether that's they're still interested in the same kind of motivation, or there's something more than that. I don't know, but it's a bit of a strange aspect, that.
So tell us about the book. Where can people get it? It's on sale now. How can people order a copy?
So yeah, the book was published in excuse me. The book was published in March. It's been out a couple of months now. It's doing great, we think, and it's available obviously on Amazon. Excuse me. Obviously on Amazon. It's in Waterstones as well, and a variety, and Asda. You can get it in Asda and a variety of other websites as well. So it's doing great, and so yeah. If anyone's interested in this case, then it's it's the most in-depth biography of him, really, and the fascinating aspect of it, different to any other book that's ever been written, is the fact that his voice is there and he responds to it, as well as being able to describe his attacks and his childhood. But he responds to every theory about why he turned into a serial killer himself, and gives his own theories and his own thoughts. So it is another dimension which has never been written before.
Fascinating insight to the book, I'm the Yorkshire Ripper, Conversations with a Killer, written by Robin Perrie and Alfie James. I'll stick the links below if you want to go and order a copy for yourself or for somebody else. Please do. Robin, as always, absolute pleasure to speak to you, mate. Take care. Thanks very much, and good luck with the book.
Mitch. Thanks very much, and thanks again for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.